everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're going to get started here. First, we can definitely tell this is a pretty hot topic. We're very excited to see we had almost 400 registrations for this webinar. So can tell a lot of people are thinking about this. I can see the live attendees here keep streaming in. So pretty cool. We're excited to talk to you about this today. So I think we're going to dive right in. So let's get started. I think, we're going to talk for maybe 20 or 25 minutes here. We've got some ideas to share with you. We're going to do a couple of polls as well along the way, where we just want to get a sense of kind of how you guys are all thinking about the reasons you hold tryouts and a couple of other questions, and see just kind of how those kind of jive with what we've been hearing, what we've been learning as well. And well, as far as questions go, we really want to keep this, interactive towards the end. So we will, there's a question feature that you should see in your view there. So feel free to type in a question at any time. We're going to wait till the end to address those, but I really hope we get some good questions. We've had a few sent in ahead of time from people who couldn't make it that we will address at the end. So they'll be available for the recording. Last kind of thing I want to say before we get going is you will hear perhaps a bit of a soccer flavor to the message today, only because of the time of year and just the clubs that we've been talking to. I know we had a lot of registrations across a ton of different sports and different organization types, everything from, clubs to little leagues. So I promise the content will be relevant regardless, but just wanted to point that out. Stick with us if it seems like it's for soccer. It really applies everywhere. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to jump in here and first just wanted to talk a little about what we're actually going to cover today. So, one of the fundamental ideas here is, why do you actually hold tryouts? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to share Ruth with me. I'll introduce properly in a second. Ruth talked to, 5 seasoned club directors and got some insights from them. And again, we're going to share. We're going to do a couple of polls. We've got, looks like about 160 attendees on live. So I think we should get some good information from those polls as well. And we're going to talk about tips for how you can actually accomplish the goals of tryouts, even if you can't hold a physical tryout, which of course is not something we had really thought about a lot previously, but is definitely needed at this moment. And then, of course, when you talk about tryouts, really you're talking about kicking off your season in most cases. And that means you're really looking for that registration revenue that starts at that time, and how you might be able to trigger that without even a conventional tryout event. So by way of introduction, I've got Ruth Nicholson here with me. Ruth is the founder of Go. She is often described as an organizational alchemist. She works with many youth sports organizations in leadership roles, really helping them, make good decisions, manage the organization soundly, and navigate a ton of different challenges that they might face. Ruth has been involved in youth sports for a long time and brings a lot of insight. And she also works part-time for TeamGenius. She is one of our customer success coaches. So I know we've got a really a high number of current customers on the call today. So many of you may be familiar with her, but she does train customers, help people get the most out of the tool, whether that's tryouts or ongoing evaluations. So I'm going to turn it over to Ruth here in a minute, but to introduce myself first, my name is Knutson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of TeamGenius. Looking at the attendee list here, I know I've met a good number of you, but if you're not familiar with me or TeamGenius, we're a player evaluation software company. So we help organizations improve tryouts, player feedback and development programs, really moving those processes that are traditionally managed using paper and spreadsheets to a web and mobile system, and has a lot of benefits of course, pulling all your data in one place so you actually retain that data as an asset for the organization, which can be useful in times like this, or also getting new coaches up to speed and that sort of thing. So not going to talk really about TeamGenius today, to be clear, but I think it's important to point out who we are and why we're actually qualified to talk about this. Between Ruth and myself and our company, we support hundreds of organizations with tryouts and evaluations every year. running, our customers run many thousands of events every year using our tools. So we do see a lot of different things. We've learned a lot about this area, and let's jump into the content. So to kick us off here, I'm going to turn over to Ruth, and she's going to, so Ruth, what's going on that kind of prompted this topic, and who did you talk to about it?
Right. So I actually live north of Seattle, Washington, and my neighborhood is literally one of the first that was affected by the coronavirus in some really personal ways. Some of us have actually been self-quarantined since the 1st of March, and that defines some really different ways of conducting yourself. But about 9 days ago, one of my colleagues said, "Well, Ruth, how are we going to do tryouts? I mean, you're shut down in Washington, right?" And soccer in Washington, as an example, normally does tryouts in like mid to late April. And our schools are closed, our fields are closed, our gyms are closed. The emergency, state of emergency says, no, you can't do youth sports, not training, not games, nothing. So we've got clubs right now who are wrestling with what are we going to do? We're delaying tryouts, and that means we can't form teams. And it raises a whole bunch of questions around team formation, around how many coaches can I have? How many coaches do I need? What's my cash flow going to look like if nobody's registering? And so it was a Sunday afternoon. It literally was 9 days ago. Things move so fast right now. And so I got on the phone and I called 5 of my Go directors of coaching, folks that I work with in Go. And they're in California and Virginia, Texas, North Carolina, and here in Washington State. And they've worked in the game at all levels. All of them are now working in the youth game, but they've played for the national team, for professional clubs. They've coached at the youth and collegiate and professional level. They've been general managers of organizations. They've founded youth soccer clubs. One of them used to be the director of coaching for U.S. Soccer. And I asked them all pretty much the same questions. Tell me about tryouts. What are the options given that we can't get on the field right now? And so for the next little bit, we're going to do 3 rounds. I sort of have 3 big ideas that came out of these conversations on a Sunday afternoon. And I want to match up what I heard from these directors of coaching with what your experience is in your sport and in your community. So we're going to do 3 polls and see what you think. And then I'm going to share with you what I got from these directors of coaching that have decades of experience in the game. So if you're in on it, our first question is, what are the most important reasons you hold tryouts?
Great. So you should be seeing a poll question here. We're just going to open that for a minute here and see the responses coming in. I can see a lot of those coming in now. Just give that another 5 or 10 seconds here. All right, looks like our responses are slowing down here. So I'm sure there's a way to share the results on the screen here, but I'm going to just kind of read them off real quickly because I can see a couple of clear winners here. We did get answers in all 5. It was to find the best players for my team, figure out teams, how many teams we'll have, place players on the right team, etc. So 76% of you said it was to place players on the right team. The next highest answer was to figure out how many teams we will have, and that was at 50%, followed by to gain visibility and market your club at 30%, and then the other 2 responses for about 25%. So a pretty decent distribution. Obviously, there's varying degrees of weight. I'm sure all of these apply on some level, but clearly, placing players on the right team and identifying how many teams you actually need were the number 2 reasons there. And that was from 85% of our attendees voting. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to let Ruth share what she heard, and then we're going to do 2 more rounds of this.
Right. So what I heard, one of the directors of coaching I talked to had played for the national team, is incredibly competitive, and he says, we want our club to attract players, so they see us, they see our teams as the place to play, the place to be competitive, the place to learn and develop, and ideally, everyone I talked to said, yeah, that's the ideal. And then we dug into the logistics, what's behind that, what really happens. So we're going to go, before we hop into the other two insights, we're going to do another quick poll, the second of the three. And this time, I want to know how you form your teams.
Great. So that should be available. We'll do the same thing here. Great. I can see some answers coming in here. Just give that about 5 or 6 more seconds. All right, so here I can see of the 3 responses, about 44% said, we make as many teams as we can and we don't cut players. The other 2 responses were about, 30%, which were, set number of teams and spots to fill, or kind of the standard, cut players who do not fit. So again, a pretty decent distribution. I would imagine that reflects the types of different organizations we have, represented on the call here. I know like I said, we have, many different sports, and we have, everything from kind of rec to competitive, and many organizations, of course, have both of those programs. So Ruth, back to you.
So this was really part of the fun part of conversations with these directors of coaching, because what came out of it were short-term needs and long-term needs. So tryouts are really tactical ways we hit short-term needs, about forming teams and knowing how many teams we're going to have, knowing how many coaches we're going to need. A way to provide a kickoff for play, good information for our players, for our families, what to expect over the next season, over the next few months, and to begin registration. And with registration comes cash flow. And we work with a lot of clubs who get the bulk of their operating funds right after tryouts, right after they form teams. And so it's a really nervous time for folks who are coming up against tryouts right now. So short-term needs, you're forming teams, you're getting out information, you're beginning that revenue flow, you're figuring out how many coaches you need. But long-term, the need is to retain players and coaches, because that's what, keeps you alive. What you do your programming for. It's how you keep kids in the sport. So separating the short-term needs and the long-term needs, and neither of those requires a traditional huge Saturday morning tryout. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go along. There's still a need for assessments and placing kids on teams, but is there another way to do it? So the last question I asked these directors of coaches were, how many players do you already know you want before you go into tryouts? And I'm really curious as to what you're going to say to this one.
I am too. All right. And we're about 60% voted so far, so we'll give it another minute. We're hitting about 85% who voted on the last 2. All right, there's our about 85%, and let's see. Okay, so we have 41% who said they already know 76 to 100% of the players they want. 31% answered that they know 51 to 75% of the players, Maybe just one or two people said kind of in that low, 26 to 50% or 1 to 25%. And then we had 20% response saying they start fresh every year and everyone tries out. So really insightful there. So basically, 72% of the responses knew half their players or more.
Well, this is the answer when I called my directors of coaching, and they said, and what surprised me, I'm talking to people from California to Virginia, from North Carolina to Washington, Texas, Arizona, and they all said, Ruth, most of our coaches know 90 to 95% of the players they want before tryouts. That the tryout itself, that event, is really for 5, 10, 20% of the players you're looking at. You actually know the core of the team that you want to return or that you want to invite to play for you. And so you take a deep breath and you go, wow, we have tryouts to form teams. And in order to put players on teams, you've got to have a base of knowledge around their skills and abilities. Your top answer was getting players on the right team, right? That was the first poll we took. So given that traditional tryouts are problematic for at least April, maybe a little longer, right? How can you still achieve the goal of forming your teams using the knowledge of players that you currently have or that's easy to get? So what if coaches already know their players? They know what players they want, and a high percentage of those players are with your club already. They're known to you. And what if you have player evaluation information? It might live in your head. It might live in your notebook of your game notes. It might be in a spreadsheet somewhere. It might be in your computer in some player evaluation software. But what if that information actually is known amongst your coaches in some form? If half or better of your teams are known, what if you invited those players to be on your team now? What if you know this is an unusual circumstance and you started forming teams with the information you know now? Now, it's not perfect. And, it's actually not even ideal, right? But that means that the tryout thing is really focused around new players. Somewhere between 5 and 50% of the players that you might be considering for your team. This is fewer players to focus on than you would if you had that really big event for tens or hundreds of kids on a weekend, right? So think about, can you invite them to a training session when you can get back on the field? Can you invite them to online things that you're doing now? Can you hold supplemental tryouts, hopefully later in the summer, but before the fall league seasons begin? It's not ideal, but again, you're not dealing with everybody necessarily on your team. You're dealing with a smaller number of kids. Can you ask their past coaches? Can you get feedback from their past coaches? If we want to keep kids engaged, can we suspend a little bit of the competitiveness that we have because we play sports and we like to win? But find out about players from their past coaches. Get that information on where do they fit. And video. In this day and age, video is easier to deal with. Can you get clips of them at training, at past games, even in the backyard doing some things that you might want to take a look at? What are the ways you can look at that smaller number of players to try to figure out where they best fit in terms of the teams you're forming? So you remember our poll, our first poll. What do you want to get out of tryouts? Why do we do tryouts? We form teams. We want to place players on the best team for them. How many coaches do you need? And once players start registering, you have funds to keep your doors open to weather the tough times. So it begins with thinking about what you want to accomplish short-term and long-term. And I have a way that I like to remember this. My grandson is 5. Logan started playing soccer in a little town called Eatonville. at the base of Mount Rainier last fall. And in his first game, he scored not once, not twice, but 3 times, 2 for his team, once for the other guys. All goals are great when you're 5 years old. And as we're walking off the field, he says, "Grandma, do you want to know how I did it?" He says, "This is how I do it. First, I think about what I want to do. And then I kick the ball and I kick the ball and I kick the ball until it goes in the goal, because when I use my head first, I know I can do it." So I believe that if we think about what we want to accomplish, we can approach tryouts and team formation a little differently, so that we can maintain the connections and the continuity between our athletes, our coaches, our clubs, the sports that we really love, and we'll get through the tough times. When I think about what I want to do and I use my head first, I know I can do it.
That's good, Ruth. Thank you. No, I think that's a great message. I think the key here is just kind of thinking a little creatively this year. We all are comfortable with the traditional tryouts in most cases, and this year just begs us to look at, what are tryouts actually for, and are there other ways of accomplishing those goals? And I think what we're hearing a lot of, right, of course, right when this happened, and as a business ourselves, we're a small business, and we've got a lot of our customers start with tryouts with us, and of course when this happened, we start going in, man, we got to figure out how to keep our business going when clubs might not be running tryouts this year. And so we picked up the phone and started talking to as many of our customers as we could get to, and more to come. And the consensus is really that, we have this past data. We've been doing evaluations, and we can look at video, and our coaches are home and might be bored out of their minds at this point, and might have opportunities to watch game film that they wouldn't have otherwise, or do an evaluation. So we start documenting that data in a place that it's accessible and useful to us over time. We actually just got off a call with a customer yesterday who's actually looking at, they've used us for tryouts in the past, and are also looking at, they've done mid and end of season evaluations regularly. So they're looking at last year's data and going to form their teams this year based exactly on that data. They can see, 3 different evaluation periods last year. They can see how those players have gotten better over the course of that season. And again, no, it's not perfect, but we're looking at, what we can do in the meantime to make the best of the situation. So with that, I want to turn it over to questions here in a minute. So if you do have a question, please just drop it in the question tool. Feel free to include your name and what organization you're with, where you're from, anything like that. I'll be sure to call it out when I read the questions. Before that, I want to do a quick call to action, just that, we're going to have a weekly webinar as a company. So we're doing we're going to do more like this, but every Friday at 2 p.m. Central, we're going to have just an open webinar. We'll include a link to that in our follow-up email with the recording of this webinar. And we're just inviting, a good number of our customers join those to, help get them set up for a particular evaluation or ask questions. But we also want it to be more of an open forum. So if you're struggling with your club, or something some decision you need to make, or want to know what we're hearing as we talk to others, we're there for you. So Ruth will be on those calls. A good number of our team, many of you know Gabe, our customer success manager, who will be on those calls as well. And it's just a chance to jump in and ask some questions in maybe a smaller setting than this. But wanted to invite you all to join us for that. And then to get us started on the questions, let's see here. I've got. All right, and this is from Barry Aerosmith, and he says, "We have multiple teams per age group in our club. Did any of the club directors you spoke with mention how they would handle the players and families who unfortunately need to be moved down to a second or third team?" That's a great question. Ruth, that one's for you.
Oh, yeah, right. Boy, that's never an easy conversation. I have always erred on the side of candor in terms of where players are in their development and where they're going to get the best fit for the experience they're going to have. Things like, are you going to end up sitting on the bench the whole time? Are you going to get some decent playing time so you can grow? I know years ago, I was working with a club, and there was a young man who was on the B team, and he had to take 1 or 2 buses to get to practice. He really wanted to play, but he lived in a part of town. He didn't have a way to get to practice. It was easy, so it was a big deal when he got to practice. And he started on the B team, and he worked his way up to the A team. And then the coach said, "Well, you don't belong in our club anymore. You need to go to one of the academies. You have progressed to a point." So he went to a local academy. And then a number of years ago, we were in Philadelphia for the United Soccer Coaches Convention. And we were out visiting the Philadelphia Union facilities. And we hear this fella yell across the pitch, "Coach, coach, you're here." And he had made it to the Philadelphia Union Academy. So helping people understand that there's a way to grow, there's a way to progress, and it doesn't always mean being on the A team.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to keep going here. There's a good number of questions in the queue here. Just a really quick one to knock out. Someone was asking about the audience that was on the call. Looking at I said it was almost 400, but generally these are clubs and associations. A few high schools, a few college programs, but primarily clubs and associations. So not a lot of high school or college, but so then the next question we got is, this is from Jared Appel. And this is about, if you charge for tryouts, maybe, 20, $50, something like that, should we be charging for tryouts this year? And I'll let you think about that for a second, Ruth, and maybe give my take. I mean, from our experience, most organizations, at least on the competitive side, do charge for tryouts. Some places in a very, if they're in a very, very competitive area and they're worried about, well, maybe they won't come to my tryout if I charge and the club down the street isn't. But I think the answer is yes. If it's something you've done in the past, I don't think you should not do that now. It's an easy way to generate or at least break even on your tryout. And at least from our experience, this really never tends to be a sticky point for parents. They understand, maybe you cut the shirts that you generate for tryouts, that can be a marketing tool, but maybe you cut the tryout jersey, keep the fee the same and make a little bit of money for the club and, deal with the exception of the parent perhaps that has a problem with it. But I think if you can hold any sort of a tryout and you already charge for it, I would say, yes, do it anyway.
Are you going to make me disagree with my boss?
You can do that.
I have really mixed feelings about charging for tryouts. On the one hand, tryouts aren't free. I mean, field rental and staffing, and there are some base costs that go into putting on a tryout. And I think, it's reasonable to sort of recoup that. I think there is a point at which, if you're making it a huge revenue stream, it can be a turnoff for folks who want to come to your club, or who can't afford, even the entry level to get in if you're serving underserved communities. So if there's a way to cover your field costs and simplify the production around tryouts, and if tryouts are more scaled back, I think there's an argument to be made for, if not foregoing fees altogether, at least making them lower and less onerous. So now you've got two opinions.
No, that's great. There's not an easy answer to this stuff. That's why we're doing this. And I think the reality is, these organizations, you're a business too. You need, and it's important to think about yourself as a business. And that means that, sometimes you have to charge for your product or your services. So next question, and let's see here. So Do you think people, this is from, sorry, Charlie Trogbert. Do you think people, whether tryouts are now or even in May, will be willing to make the financial commitment knowing most will lose the entire spring season this year? Yeah, go ahead, Ruth. I have a couple ideas here. I'm sure you do too.
Oh yeah. So actually I did talk to some folks about that, and I thought, how do you have a year-round fee when at this point nobody's crystal ball tells us when the season is going to start, right? And with a couple of my clients, we tossed around the idea of segmenting the year, say by summer and then fall, winter, and then next spring. And so the fee for the summer would look different. It wouldn't be zero, but it would be less. And then the regular levels of fees then kicked in when you had fields and gyms and ice time, and were incurring more of those costs. I mean, the silver lining is if you're renting fields from school districts or parks departments, you're probably not spending that money right now because they're closed down. So hopefully you're saving a little money at a time when maybe you can scale back your fees near term and then make them match better to your budgetary needs later in the year. Hopefully sooner than later, but.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And we're seeing a lot of organizations are still running some sort of programming now, trying to do it remotely and keep coaches engaged, whether that's sharing, daily exercises or drills and sharing video back and forth and things like that. I'm not sure it's realistic to charge for that, but if there's any way that you can kind of continue adding value and keeping those customers or those players happy, that's a good thing.
There was it this morning we heard there were some clubs, I think they were in California, who were refunding the volunteer fees they were collecting. So for some clubs, in order to encourage volunteerism from their parents, they collect a fee at the time of registration, and if the parents complete their volunteer commitment to the club, they get that money refunded back to them at the end of the season. And there are clubs right now who are refunding those volunteer fees just off the top, as a show of community and knowing that there's some folks who've lost jobs and it's tight for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's see. A lot of questions here, so I'm just kind of filtering through. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to everybody, but we're going to try. I guess I will commit to staying on until we get through these if people are still on and listening. So there's a couple of questions about, issuing refunds and, especially if you have, money that was already spent organizing the league and such, so you collect the money, you start spending it, and then you get a request for a refund. How are you handling that? I will speak about this only from a fellow, I'm a small business owner. We're a small business at TeamGenius, and this is something, luckily we haven't heard a lot of yet, but yeah, it's very real. It's people want a refund, but it's like, hey, do you still want a refund if it means that, we might not be around? And I don't think that, that's a dire way to put it, but I think you got to be real with people. I think if you're able to kind of explain like, hey, I understand if you really need a refund, or if there's a way of maybe offering a credit for next year, maybe, hey, we'll give you next year's winter training programs for free or something like that. And I'm just brainstorming here, but if there's some way you can, number one, be transparent about the reality of if you give everyone their money back, what does that mean for the feasibility of the organization? And two, are there other ways to sort of, offer value in the future so that, hey, we'll keep your money now, but you're going to get something extra. I'm not sure exactly what that would be, but if there's a credit for a future use or something like that, or a future season, or even if you have to, a partial refund would be, of course, better than a full one, because you like this one in particular, especially if you've already spent some of that money. But from my experience, people are generally pretty reasonable if you can explain, hey, this is what it means for us if if you get your money back, is that still something you want to do? And, maybe that's me being an optimist, but just a couple thoughts on that. So, question about creating young teams. So, if yes, the kids for the older players, but if you have, U8s, 9s, 10s where you don't have that history, are there any ways we could do that? And that question, Coach Olger Dalipi from FCF Valley out of Connecticut.
Out of Connecticut. Yeah, I've been noodling about this one, and I don't have a great answer for that, because you really, you probably don't have any coach who's seen them play, and they're changing so fast as little ones. I think that's one of the areas where it's something of a wild guess and an experiment, and this year's just, it's not going to be as ideal as we want it to for the little ones. And I've got grandchildren in that age group, and I have no idea how I would decide what team to put Logan and Luca on.
Yeah.
And I've seen them
play. So you stumped us. Yeah, right. It's no easy answers here, but let's see. I'm going to jump to the next one, and this is from Gabby Garbato from USA Volleyball. Do you feel that video tryouts are just as effective as in-person tryouts? If so, how can we better the efficiency of video tryouts?
Ooh, I actually talked to a player. He's currently playing at the professional level, but he actually grew up in our neighborhood and was drafted as a homegrown player for the Seattle Sounders, and the neighborhood went wild. And we talked about video tryouts, and he was talking from a player perspective, but he's also coaching now. And he said, well, Ruth, everybody who sends in a video, they're only going to send in the good highlights, right? No one's going to send you a bad highlight because they're trying to get your attention. He says, but when he's looking at video of players and tryouts, he wants to see videos, not less of individual skill and more of the player in a situation with other players, because he's evaluating not only that personal skill, but the interactions with other players in the sport. And so I don't think it's as effective as an in-person tryout, but if you're going to use video, his recommendation was have it with other players so you can see those interactions, and that'll help you better assess things like game sense and spacing and things like that.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In a situation where you have multiple teams and age group, good ideas of top players and bottom players, would you recommend forming the top and bottom teams and then holding a modified tryout in late spring or early fall to place those kind of middle or bubble players? That's from Timothy Bennett.
Ooh, that's a creative idea. That's a really creative idea. If you can, there are some associations that will let you use, sometimes it's called a player pass, to put players, and you can move them between teams if you have numbers issues, or if you have bubble players and you're sort of moving them between, the equivalent of JV and varsity. The other thing is there's some leagues that take a dim view of using a lot of first team players and dropping them down to the second team for the purposes of winning games. Not that anybody on this webinar would ever do that. And so strategically, I know some clubs will put more players on their second team or their B team than they do on their A team, because leagues don't look askance at moving B team players up to an A team for a game, but they get a little nervous if you keep dropping top level team members down to B teams. But I like that idea to sort of figure out how you're going to do that middle group where they could go up or down.
Right. And that's typically where the traditional tryouts are most useful, right? Is that middle group.
Yeah.
I see a few questions. Let's see. Well, first, a couple about the deck and if we'll be sending this out. Yes, we'll send out the recording of this and the deck as well. Let's see. So pay structure for coaches. I see one from, Lisa Wolf, executive director of Salvo Soccer here in Minnesota, where I am. And then I see, Matthew Myers as well, really about, our clubs revising pay structure for coaches, with the unknown start of the season, or handling payment of professional coaches.
Whoa, I haven't talked to people about that. I know I have some old pay constructs from the former director of coaching at US Soccer as to how he put together his pay scale, which was a combination of licensing level, how long they'd been with the club, and a performance bonus, because he actually did coaching evaluations every year. So it was a combination of elements that played into the salary structure. I don't know what people are doing right now when they've got coaches in essence in transition from in the soccer world, from coming off the old season and starting tryouts in the new season and making that transition. That's a great thing to look into. I'm adding it to my to-do list.
Let's see. Definitely a good number of additional questions here. Here's one. This asker has asked to remain discreet or anonymous, which I think I can see why from the question. What is your suggestion for a brand new club in a very competitive market that's not announced? It was going to be announced this week and have tryouts in May. So yeah, that's a tough scenario.
Wow.
All I can think of, and this is putting just more my kind of entrepreneurial marketing background at it, not sports specifically, but I would try to look at it as much as possible as an opportunity. And that means if, you're in this situation in a bad time, just like the rest of us, but is there a way that starting with a clean slate right now allows you to do something that the clubs you're competing with can't do or won't do because they are sort of focused on the way they've always done it, for lack of a better way of putting it? Is there, an alternative model or training scenario? Of course, you have to get those players in to begin with, but that's the only thing that comes to mind for me is, I can't be too specific because I just don't, I guess, know enough specifics, but I would just try to scratch your head and think, is there something you can offer that others can't, precisely because you don't exist yet and you don't have sort of the defined processes and programs that these other clubs might have? Ruth, anything? I don't know.
Oh, I'm really glad you answered that one. I have a club I'm working with that's in that space, and yeah, figuring out how to offer value in really difficult times that makes you differentiate from others. What's your competitive advantage in terms of either programming or drive time or personal attention, or those sorts of things.
I've got one here that I think is a good, based on your background, Ruth. It's from Andrew Hammer, and he's asking, have you seen any clubs sending surveys to parents regarding the current environment?
Not regarding the current environment. I have worked with a number of clubs who do both surveys on their coaches, feedback on their coaches, and feedback on the organization as a whole. And it's helped them figure out what programs are most valued by their members, what programs, that are most desired. And so I've done surveys for clients where we did sort of a programmatic survey about, these activities and how valuable were they to you as club members, as well as feedback on senior staff, board members, and coaches, and then sort of matching those up. I had one club that actually it was an online survey every year that was anonymous, and then a member of the board of directors and the director of coaching met with the parents of every team in the club once a year towards the end of the year. They'd send the coach and the kids out to practice. And the board member and the director of coaching would meet with the parents and get an in-person flavor of, how did it go this year? In this climate, you're probably looking at needing to do that via Zoom or GoToMeeting or some electronic format. But that's another way to get feedback, direct feedback from the parents of what are your experiences, what are your worries, what do you need right now to get through this?
Let's see. So Ruth, we talked a little bit about this offline, but the idea of, taking, best way to describe this, taking, your best shot at player assignment, in if you can't hold a trial, and then have some sort of grace period where you're able to, make moves of those players. And I see a few questions that seems not no one asked that directly, but there's a couple of questions that kind of follow that theme of, how do I communicate with a family who maybe their player has to move down this year, or, maybe I guess it could apply to those young age groups where you don't know the kids, or if you're a new club and you don't have past evaluation data. How would you encourage people to think about that?
My first reaction is don't try to play a game with it. The sugar coating, doesn't always work. If the answer is there's a spot for your child, on the second team, there are reasons behind that. There are probably things you as a coach know that can help them, progress at that level as opposed to the other team. I think right now, just being candid with people and not making them guess and not making them string along. And if you say, we're putting kids on teams right now, we know it's not perfect, and we've got a window in, say, August or September where we're going to reassess and move kids around once we know a little bit more. If you're going to say that, do that. Don't say it and don't do it, because people will see through that game. But if you're going to do it, make a good faith attempt in whatever month that is to really reassess and try to put kids where they best belong.
Some transparency in what you're going to do, and then stick to it and kind of attack it with conviction, right? Yeah. I see a few questions about related to, the season, and, at what point, how do you perhaps make the decision to cancel it outright? I know that's something we had talked a little bit about offline, and it's tough to come up with something that is sort of a one size fits all, but are there any triggers or things you might be looking for to help people make that decision?
No, haven't made that decision since yesterday. I do. I have a client who's a general manager of a WPSL team, amateur women's team, and there really were two factors. One was, were the divisions in that league going to actually be able to play a season? So a league decision that was a make or break. And the other was the real financial condition, the coaching staff, could they weather a delayed season or a canceled season as an organization? Could they survive that? It happened to be a very new team. And with their startup costs, they didn't think they could actually make it as a startup at that point. And so they pulled the plug. So it's really a two-part decision. One is a decision on the part of your league as to whether the league is going to operate, and the other is, do you have enough reserves and creativity to keep the doors open long enough to weather the storm? So I think it's a two-part question.
Yeah. I'm just kind of looking at some of the question in the chatter here, and I see, Mern King, talking about, how we're the only country that places players on teams and then they never move during the season.
Oh.
So yeah, I mean, and I do see there's several comments, related to that. So is there an opportunity? I mean, we did talk about this a little bit, but, especially for this season, to go in setting that expectation that, because we're not able to follow the process that we're comfortable with and that we know from the past, here's what we're going to do to make sure we don't, leave people out. Or everyone said, right, one of the top reasons to hold tryouts really is getting players on the right teams. And if that's really the goal, I think we have to sort of unapologetically, change our process to accomplish that.
Well, and do we come out better at the other end in being able to do that more nimbly? I mean, are there some benefits to us as clubs, to our athletes, to our marketability, if we say, we're actually willing to move players when it's appropriate to do that, and then we follow through with that? Does that make you more competitive in your market because you actually, followed your words with action?
Yeah, and follow-up question to that just came in. So if you do that and move players between teams, how do you adjust if you charge different fees to first teams or second teams?
Ooh. Wow. I don't know a lot of clubs that actually do charge differently between first teams and second teams.
Well, I suppose if you're moving up, it's pretty easy. Yeah, Charlie's saying in the Midwest, everyone does that. So if, use a per team fee, I mean, I would imagine if you're moving up a tier and you're going to the parent and saying, hey, this is more expensive, you owe us the difference, that's probably not a problem. It's more in the case of, a player potentially moving down a tier where they had paid at a higher level and now aren't.
So is that the opportunity where you have a combination of, is it a refund, is it a credit, is there still some other benefit that you can offer as a club that fills in that value gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think wherever possible, we should be trying, generally just a business practice, wherever possible, you don't want to be giving people refunds or money back. It's just, it's tough, right? You're a business. And if there's a way you can, even a credit on the season, which encourages them to not go to another club if they have a credit for the next season sitting in their account, and I don't know how manageable that is, but again, I'm just brainstorming here, but that's something I would think about. If there's, like you said, Ruth, if there's a way to create some additional value there so that you're never giving money back, that's, I think, ideal. Let's see. I know maybe the last thing, and this is, I see a good bit of questions kind of about, somewhere along the lines of like, how do we actually take previous data and help form teams from that? And I think there's quite a few ways. I mean, look, we support over, let's say, about more than 400 organizations every year, and everyone does evaluations differently, whether that's tryouts or it's a mid-season evaluation. It really comes down to, if you have, it's about first making sure you have that data. Many clubs still don't, or they don't have it in any usable format. It's individual PDF documents that are saved on someone's desktop, for example. But if you do have that data, it becomes how you're able to sort of look at any sort of trends over time. You might see a player who has improved significantly over the course of the last season, and there's really pretty good evidence then that is going to continue, or that player maybe can be on a higher level team. It's not easy, because you can always argue that, well, maybe these players plateaued, or some got a lot better over the summer or over the winter training sessions, that sort of thing. But I think if anything, it's about getting in the habit of doing evaluations. And yes, of course, I would say that given my role in my company, but I think the clubs that we're talking with, many of who are customers who have been doing this for a while now, are quite glad that they have this data to fall back on and to make those decisions and communicate from. So let's see if we have any. I know there's a lot of questions here, so I really apologize if I missed any major themes or any big questions here. All right, so this looks less of a question, more of a response from Marco Raduca. We do a base fee for annual dues, then each team gets a special seasonal package to cover league and tournament assignments, which is tiered on volume, distance, competitiveness, and cost. We then adjust individual player accounts when they move from team to team, which is fairly minimal throughout the year and well worth keeping open player movement throughout the year. So there's more of a solution to that kind of conundrum of moving players around and the discrepancy in fees. Yeah. So this is awesome. This is what we were hoping would happen, that people would jump in with their own ideas and tips. And just going to take one more quick glance through here and see what I missed. Salary structure for coaches. That is not something that I am very qualified to speak about, but I don't know if do you have any ideas on that, Ruth, or just a way to go about that?
Yeah, actually I've worked with a couple of DOCs on things like that are they're usually composed of multiple elements, so that there's a base salary either per team. There's a experience or licensing component of sort of your experience in the game. There's a loyalty. How long have you been with the club? Are you jumping around? There's an evaluation of how well you've done as a coach that year, which is both from the director of coaching and perhaps parent input. And are there other special things you do for the club? Are you a coach for a specialty position, or the nutritionist, or another element of that? And then the bonus component often is if you have longevity with the club, after a couple of years, they'll pay, say, a quarter of the cost of a coaching education program. And if you're there a few more years, it's half the cost, and a few more years, they'll pay for that whole license. So the salary structures I've worked with people on have varying levels of all of those components, so that but the one thing that folks typically don't do is you can't use all of the elements to bump you into a higher bracket if you haven't earned the next level license up. You can't substitute all those other things for licensure, but there are ways to package it so that it reflects the role that those coaches are playing in your organization, as well as their contributions and their performance.
Excellent. I think that's a good stopping point. We're just coming up on time here. Just wanted to wrap up with, again, pointing out, we'll be sharing this recording. You'll get an email probably tomorrow with recording, and I believe the slides we can share as well. And then again, it's not feasible to, of course, open up the lines on with 200 people live here today. But I can tell from, again, the registrations that we got and the participation today, which we really appreciate. There's a lot to talk about here, well outside of tryouts. I encourage everyone to join our Friday webinars every Friday, 2 p.m. Central. We'll send a link to that as well in the follow-up. But in that scenario, we will have the lines open so we can just have more of a conversation rather than kind of chat and answer or question answer through text. So really looking forward to those. And thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Ruth, for the great insights. Really appreciate everyone's time, and look forward to the follow-up tomorrow. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.